Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Sensitive Podcast. I am your host, Kim Kimball, Somatic Leadership Coach for highly sensitive and neurodivergent women business owners and leaders. And I am with Michelle today, and we are talking about the missing link discovery for highly sensitive and neurodivergent leaders. I'm so excited to dive into all of this exciting research and to hear more about Michelle's discoveries. I think you will find them very, very juicy. So, without further ado, I am going to allow her to introduce herself and take it away.
Yeah. Hi, Kim. And thank you for having me here on the podcast.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So my name is Michelle Dowker. Right now I work with sensitive, deep thinking entrepreneurs, creatives, professional visionaries they've evolved personally and they want their work to evolve with them and they want to thrive and feel fulfilled while they're doing it. And of course, that wasn't the work that I started with.
It never is it?
Right? Yeah, I've had a quite a non-linear progression to where I am now. It came after quite a number of pivots. So it all started when I left home and went to university, and I was studying biomedical sciences, and I was involved in biomedical research. So that's where the research part of my interests all started. And at that point, when I completed my master's, I was sick. I got so sick I couldn't continue with school. Doctors were like, "There's nothing we can do. We don't know what's wrong with you." And it was during that time when I discovered changing my diet and lifestyle turned things around for me. And it was like, okay, there's something here. And that set me on the road of going back to school. And I did another 4 years to become a naturopathic doctor. I wanted to help people to the level that I had discovered, right, when the medical system said, meh, you're just going to have to live with it. And so I became a naturopathic doctor, and I was a clinical naturopathic doctor on the west coast of Canada for a number of years. And while I enjoyed it, there was still something about it that just didn't fit. I knew that there was some deeper something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And then the universe hit me over the head with a baseball bat, as can sometimes happen. A whole bunch of things happened at once, including my mother passed away, and it put me into a health crisis. By this point, I had moved back east to be closer to my mother. And during this health crisis, which I realized I have endometriosis and an autoimmune condition, and it had flared up after the stress of my mom's passing, which is a really common thing that can happen. However, all the stuff that I knew to do as a naturopathic doctor wasn't helping. And it's almost like it pushed me to continue on this path of exploration of what my purpose really is. And I had to go through this process. I discovered this process of really healing my own inner world. And I'd already done a whole bunch of therapy and all that stuff. And it was really this understanding of that there's something deeper than that. And I ended up discovering about looking at the unconscious mind and how important that is, which I didn't know about before. And as I did that, I was getting better, and I started helping people who were like me, who had these conditions and nothing else worked for them. And I started guiding them through the process that I guided myself through. They got me back on my feet. They got me feeling well again, and not only well, but really stepping into what felt more purposeful for me. And so as I did, I was starting to see some trends with the people that were responding to the work that I was doing, and I was continuing to learn and collect information in the background. And I was started to notice that the people who responded the best were people who identified as highly sensitive people, like me. And I knew a bit about HSP, but I didn't know a whole lot at that point. So that took me into a rabbit hole of learning all about the science behind that. And I started to work more specifically with highly sensitive people. And, once I took them through this initial, like looking at their unconscious mind, and doing all this inner work, they'd come out the other side and say, well, my work doesn't feel aligned anymore. And we started also working on that, and that really lit me up. And so as all of this was happening, I was continuing my own work with my own unconscious mind, and I was taking more and more classes and courses and certifications. And I think it was probably in October last year that I had this moment after I had a huge breakthrough from my last certification course. And I said, there's something here that's bigger than me, and I need to put this together. And I had been collecting years of scientific research on all of these different subjects that I had been figuring out for myself. And I essentially extricated myself from social media and doing any extra things outside of working with my clients, and really just sat down and put a whole bunch of this research together to better understand what's actually going on. And yeah, we're going to talk about that today.
Yeah, what a journey. What stands out to me? Well, first of all, I know obviously we've connected prior to this recording and recognized that we were both in healthcare. For those of you who may not have listened to all my episodes or listened to some of the episodes where I talk about also being a doctor of physical therapy, I'm also a doctor of physical therapy. You're a naturopathic doctor, and we both had many years in that world. Um, and I'm sort of seeing the similarities, the parallels of those paths, and the parallels of where our path has taken us. But also, the thing that stood out to me was you saying, that you had a flare up of endometriosis, and autoimmune condition. And again, if anybody has listened to more of my story and some of the other podcast episodes, I went through a really intense period as well, where I mean, well, multiple things, but I was passing out and throwing up with my periods as well. Um, and I would be at work and I would be in an evaluation room with the patient and be trying to go through the motions. And I just remember being so pale and saying like, excuse me 1 second, and having to go and throw up and then go back and continue treatment. Or I would be like laying on the floor and needing a heating pad and literally not able to get up off the floor with the amount of pain that I was in. Um, and, I had thyroid conditions, and at various points, I thought I was going to have to take long-term disability from work because of the amount of exhaustion that I was experiencing, et cetera, et cetera. The story could go on and on about all of the different health symptoms and everything that I have experienced at different frames of time in my life and in my work, especially. But the piece, and I'm sure you're going to get into some of this in your research, that I was curious about you mentioning these different health flares is I've started to recognize research of, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with Lindsay Macarith, but she talks a lot about neurocomplexity and how that's not just your brain wiring, but it also happens at a cellular level and makes you more susceptible for things like autoimmune conditions and, POTS, MACAs, all of these things. So like, it's not, in other words, what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is it's not random that people who are highly sensitive or neurodivergent end up having all of these other health conditions that are trickling down, because it's literally how we are wired, not just on a brain level, but a full body level, right? And so if you're listening to this and you're resonating and you're like, oh yes, me too, and all of these mysterious health conditions that like crop up, and I also consider myself either a highly sensitive or neurodivergent person, there's a reason for that. You're not going crazy like the regular traditional medical system would like to have us believe, right? So I'm going to let you take it from there with your research and what you've discovered.
Yeah. You made some really interesting points there and really important points there, which I'll try to remember to touch upon as I'm explaining what I put together, because it's really relevant. And I love that you've mentioned Lindsay's work. I follow as well. Um, yeah, I love her theory about, gifted burnout might be why we're seeing late diagnosed autism, ADHD, and other neurodivergence. Um, and might explain a lot about my own recent diagnosis. Um, so what I put together is a few key things that I found were particularly interesting and important to note about people who do have some sort of neurodivergence, particularly sensory processing sensitivity, which is like the scientific name for highly sensitive person. And there's one theory called the environmental sensitivity theory. And originally, when they were looking at sensory processing sensitivity, they were looking at something called the diathesis stress model, meaning when somebody with sensory processing sensitivity is exposed to like negative events, um, stressors, uh, then they will be more negatively impacted by them than the average individual, um, due to less resilience to those negative events. And as they continued doing research, they were discovering that there's this other piece called Vantage sensitivity, which means there are some people who, with sensory processing sensitivity, there are others, however, they're finding that the largest percentage of people with Vantage sensitivity do have sensory processing sensitivity. And when they're positively supportive and they're in a positively supportive environment, that they will exhibit a significantly higher level of function than a Vantage resistant person or like a neurotypical person, right? Even if they do the exact same things to support themselves and they're in the exact same positively supportive environment. And through those, they discovered that actually a larger proportion of people with sensory processing sensitivity have something called differential susceptibility. And that means that they have both. So there's this diathesis stress side that when they're in a negative environment, they're going to struggle more than the average individual. And when they're in this positive environment, that they're going to have a higher level of functioning and even flourish. And this has actually been mentioned in the research, which lit me right up to say, like, this is actually how highly sensitive people can flourish, is by leveraging the Vantage sensitivity part of this model, which I thought was pretty cool. And so I'm sure you're probably thinking like, okay, so what does that actually mean, right?
Well, I'll be honest with you, the part that I'm really fascinated by, and maybe we can dive into this a little bit, um, is I wrote a blog article on this recently because I was feeling so tired of talking about burnout and so tired of like I feel like as highly sensitive or neurodivergent people, sort of the messaging out there is we always have to like micromanage our energy. We're so limited on our energy and our time and all of these things. And like if we do one thing, quote unquote, wrong, we're gonna end up in this like absolutely depleted burnout state. And it's this you can't really live in that space, right? And so what I am very intrigued by what you just shared is it sounds like what I am much more interested in moving towards is how can we get folks who are highly sensitive and neurodivergent to thriving? Like, I don't want, in your business or in your life, just because you're highly sensitive or neurodivergent doesn't mean, well, I'm going to just go through life cobbling together scraps of energy and just one hair away from like the absolute worst burnout ever that's going to take me out for years. Like, and I hear you saying that this thriving is actually accessible. And
Mhm.
just like you're saying, I am very intrigued by that because I think that is every human being's birthright. And it shouldn't be something that we feel is inaccessible to us based on our wiring, right? That we didn't choose, right?
Exactly.
So,
And, that's a really important point, and I love that you're focusing on that, right? And this is the thing, and I've noticed this, even when I was a naturopathic doctor, is a lot of systems and institutions tend to focus on, how to sort of just resolve symptoms so that you're functional again. Right? So it's about, okay, well, how can we no longer just be like in massive struggling mode so that we can just get by? And that's what a lot of these systems, like the medical system, is focused on. as opposed to what I see as possible now through all of this work that I've done, and now I'm seeing evidence of it with my clients, is that there's so much more beyond just functional, right?
Thank goodness, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, a really big key for this, especially for those of us who are highly sensitive, is one of the big keys to actually flourishing is not trying to force us into this box of how the mainstream does it, right? Is I mean, first of all, the mainstream in general, and this is just a generalization, they're looking at, well, just getting functional, right? And so even a lot of neurotypicals don't see that there's this whole other possibility beyond functional into like really flourishing in life. And I mean that in addition to all of the, the social conditioning and the hegemonic narratives and like the way society is structured is not structured for people who are highly sensitive. And I think this kind of goes to when I was talking about, right, the positive and negative things that can impact us as highly sensitive people. Um, the studies looked at, I mean, the focus was more on like those external factors and like, okay, so whether you're, being raised by supportive parents versus parents who are like, why are you so sensitive? What's wrong with you? Right. Which is like something so many of us were raised with, especially in our generation, they didn't understand this stuff back then,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? And so, I mean, that was one example. And another example is like, say, for example, making sure that you are making accommodations at work, right? So if you know that maybe some of your sensitivities are light sensitivity or sound sensitivity, to make accommodations for that so that it doesn't become so overwhelming and you don't reach a threshold. Because there's three subcategories to sensory processing sensitivity. So there's low sensory threshold or LST, there's ease of excitation or EOA, and then there's aesthetic sensitivity or AES. And so low sensory threshold is like, you're sensitive to things like loud noises and crowds and like, textures and, all those types of things. And, part of helping manage that is understanding where your thresholds are and understanding, sometimes you might be able to tolerate loud noises in singularity, but then you add in all these other facets, right? It's a large crowd and there's big lights and all the things. Then all of a sudden you've reached this threshold and now you're in like overstimulation, you're in like meltdown mode. And so that's kind of one of the superficial things in terms of finding a positive, right, environment for yourself versus a negative environment for yourself is controlling your environment, right, and the people in it. Um, and understanding, your thresholds and your triggers. And what I strongly believe, and what I'm seeing from my own observations in the work that I'm doing, is that controlling your external environment is actually secondary to something that starts more within yourself. And so what I'm finding is it's great to make sure that you put yourself in a positive environment in terms of the sensory things and the people in it and making sure that they understand you and that they're supportive of you versus like surrounding yourself with people that are just like, well, just grow a thicker skin. What's wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, though, is that there's something internal that if that isn't addressed, it doesn't matter how many positive things that you do to surround yourself with, it's only going to take you so far. It's only going to help so much. And the internal thing is your unconscious mind and what I like to call your inner operating system. And so what is that? I'm probably sure you're wondering. So your unconscious mind is comprised of a whole bunch of different neural networks that work together to impact everything. Your thoughts, your behaviors, your actions, how you respond to people, your environment. Your unconscious mind is actually runs and dictates 95% of your actions, your thoughts, your behaviors, your responses. And this is why it's so important, because it's actually what impacts, your conscious thoughts. So if you're just working at the conscious level of thinking, then if your unconscious mind is not actually aligned with what you're thinking, what you want, what you're trying to do, the changes that you're trying to make, it's only going to take you so far. Your unconscious mind is always going to win. And the unconscious mind is programmed. And a huge bulk of that program starts in your developmental years. So before the age of 8, because during those years, your conscious mind hasn't come online yet, right? That rationalizing, logical mind isn't really fully formed yet. And so during those years, you're kind of like a sponge. You're taking in everything. And all the things that you're taking in are actually programming your unconscious mind. It's programming, what it expects, how it sees things, what it believes about yourself, about the world, about other people, about how things should be. Right? So you have experiences, and your unconscious mind puts meanings to those experiences, which sets up your belief system. And especially for those of us who are highly sensitive, we are more sensitive than most to what's going on around us in terms of how it's going to program our unconscious mind. And especially because when we receive all those messages earlier on, what's wrong with you? You're too sensitive, all of those things. First of all, it's been shown that neurodivergent children receive significantly more of those messages, those negative type messages from caregivers, role models, teachers, all the things, than their neurotypical peers. And when we receive those messages, we take them in deeper. And that forms and starts to kind of program our unconscious mind. It causes, say, for example, it sets up our reticular activating system. And our reticular activating system, it's kind of located down like at the base of the brain. It's like the thing between everything coming up from your spinal cord and the rest of your brain. It's like a relay center that acts like a filter, because all the information that's coming in, sensory, what we hear, what we see, what we feel, all of these things, there's millions and millions of bits of information coming at us all at once, and we can't possibly take in all that information. It's kind of like it would be like a tidal wave coming in our front door 24 hours a day, right?
Yeah.
It's just way too much. And so this filter will filter out what the reticular activating system believes is important for you to be focusing on and see and perceive, and sends that information up to the rest of the brain in order to, it sends information to the brain and activates different parts of the brain depending on what it needs. So it'll activate, parts about your thinking brain and your prefrontal cortex. It can activate parts of like your hypothalamus, and that can impact, say, for example, your hypothalamal, oh my goodness, the HPA axis, which is involved in producing hormones like stress hormone, cortisol. Right? It's involved in impacting other hormones in your body. It's involved in impacting your metabolism. It's involved in impacting how your immune system functions. So, I mean, that in particular, can you see that association with what's going on with that reticular activating system can actually impact how your immune system functions, how your nervous system functions, what's going on with stress hormone, like all of those things. Does that make sense so far?
It makes total sense. I wanna recap and see if I'm hearing properly and sort of synthesize things for the listeners as well. Um, but what I'm hearing is essentially that you have discovered that highly sensitive and neurodivergent people are more susceptible to negative environments and they struggle more in negative environments. But with the right support, they also thrive more
Yeah.
in positive environments, which is the really exciting news that you and I were talking about earlier, and how this just micromanaging the external stimulus, since we are so much more sensitive to it, isn't really the thing that is going to be the needle mover, so to speak, because you're kind of sweeping it under the rug or whatever. It's very surface level. You're addressing it on a surface level, but the real bang for your buck is going to come from addressing the unconscious mind, which is what is influencing the HPA axis. It's influencing your nervous system state, whatever nervous system state that you're defaulting in, your
Yes.
hormone cascade, all of it. Does that
Yes.
sound right?
Absolutely. Yes. And just to continue on with that explanation, the reason why it can create what I call a negative internal environment. Because what happens is when you have all that conditioning, so, especially, you're too sensitive, all these things. And then the other piece of that conditioning is now you go and enter the workforce and you're trying to force yourself into a box. You're trying to operate in ways that the neurotypical people are, right? And so now you're like, well, what's wrong with me? Why can't I function in the same ways as these other people? All of those messages are programming your unconscious mind to feel, it programs it to try to survive. Right, it's programming it. I call it survival OS, right? And so survival OS is going to do two really main things here. It's going to first impact that filter, the reticular activating system. That filter is kind of like lenses, right, through which you're looking at everything. And when you're operating in survival OS, you're looking at the only things that you're really going to be able to pick up and perceive and process are threats, right? You are in hypervigilance mode. You're trying to protect yourself and trying to like prepare yourself for like rejection, for example. And so those are the things that your reticular activating system is noticing. It's kind of like if you decide, well, I'm going to buy a blue car, and then all of a sudden, all you see all over the place are blue cars, but you never really noticed blue cars before. It's kind of like that. Right? So it's impacting actually how you're actually perceiving the world and what you're seeing that's right in front of you. Right? And so, for that particular thing, it doesn't matter if you've now put yourself in a positively supportive environment. If your filter is still looking for rejection and threat, that's what it's looking for, and it doesn't really actually fully see the positive sides of things, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense.
So that's point number one. And then the other big thing is what's called the default mode network. And this is the part that's responsible for like that inner thought loops that go on in your mind and also self-identification. And so if your reticular activating system is programmed this way, it's going to tell your default mode network to kind of loop your thoughts in ways of like, I'm not good enough. I need to try harder. There's something wrong with me. I don't belong. And you're going to have all these internal things of like, oh my gosh, that person got upset. I did something wrong. There's something wrong with me. What do I need to do to change myself to be better kind of thing, right? Like all those kind of inner thought loops that happen. And that's not positively supportive, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, right? You can do all these things to like manage your external environment, but if those things are still looping inside of you, it's only going to take you so far because your nervous system is still going to think that there's something wrong, that you're in survival, that you need to protect yourself. And in that way, if you haven't addressed that inner piece, then you're still probably going to be operating a lot from like the diathesis stress aspect of the differential susceptibility model
Mm.
versus when you can kind of reprogram all of that. I like to call it like upgrading your operating system. right? I like to call it Vantage OS, right? Based on like the Vantage sensitivity aspect of the differential sensitivity. And so when you shift that and you can start to see the world through a new lens, right? And you start creating this new inner loop and self-identification model that's positively supportive and compassionate and kind. Um, that puts you in a situation now where you can benefit from the vantage sensitivity aspect of the differential susceptibility.
So how do you go about doing that? Yeah, it makes total sense. How do you go about doing that in your practice? Like how do you update people's operating system from survival OS to Vantage?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the thing. It's multifactorial because we are complex, factorial beings, right? Um, so part of the work that I do is, first of all, becoming aware, right, of that this is actually a thing that's going on within you because it's not really something that people talk about, right? So awareness, I always say, is the first step. And when I'm working with somebody, I like to first of all help them see the truth of who they are, right? Because so often those of us who are highly sensitive, we've been masked so long and we've been trying to be what we think other people, how we should be so that we can be accepted by other people, right? Or to, achieve whatever we think that we need to be achieving. And oftentimes we don't really fully know who we actually are. And understanding yourself, I see this as super, super empowering when you can understand yourself, how you operate, how you work, and all the different features about yourself. And I usually start with the first thing that I often do is I use as tools human design, astrology, and personality typing as the first line to help them to start to get to understand why they're designed, how they're designed, and why that is. And I've found over the years of looking at my clients' astrology charts, because I tend to bring in a very specific type of person, I've started to notice these patterns that happen over and over and over and over again in my clients' charts. And when I've like asked astrologers about this, they're like, that's not actually really common. But I'd say like 90%, 90, even 95% of my clients have at least one, if not multiple, of these particular placements and patterns that I notice over and over and over again. And so I've taken the time and studied with some astrologers who really understand these patterns to better understand what they actually mean in terms of what are your gifts? What are your strengths? What can that cause in terms of challenges that you'll more than likely experience? How to navigate those challenges most optimally, and what that means for your purpose, and what that means for who you're actually here to be. And usually when I share these things with my clients, they're like, these are things that I've already instinctively known about myself, but I never, A, I couldn't put words to it. B, I never gave myself permission to show these parts of myself or look at these parts of myself because they're different than all the people around me. And that's kind of the first step because they're like, wow, like this is who I am. And that makes total sense.
Yeah. I believe in our messages you said that most folks tend to be INFJ. Is that right on the Myers-Briggs? Which of course I am, Michelle. Um
That's surprising.
and I believe we have the same human design profile lines. Is that true? Are you a 6-2?
I am.
Yeah. It's just really funny. Yes, I'm a 6-2 manifesting generator in human design. I'm an INFJ and Myers-Briggs personality types. And then I don't know if you use Enneagram, but I'm a 6 wing 7 and Enneagram. I love all of these things as tools to understand myself and my
Right.
my strengths and, you know, basically the languaging that I use around everything that you just shared is coming to a place of accepting yourself, right? Because exactly as you're sharing, most of the time as highly sensitive neurodivergent people, there's been so much shame baked in. It just becomes part of our wiring of I'm too much or I'm not enough or I need to be different or whatever it is, right? By well-meaning folks, I'm sure, but there's a lot of internalized messaging that we need to shed, to really come to this place of self-acceptance. And I see in my clients all the time, things really click on in a way where you have an understanding of a concept of like, oh, this is why I do this, or this is why I operate in this way. And really, what that leads to is this self acceptance rather than the shame, the shutting down, the masking, the not allowing it to see the light of day, all of those things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it doesn't surprise me. You're INFJ. The
Yeah.
in my world, most people are,
Yeah.
which is really interesting because it is the rarest personality type.
Mm.
And it's even more rare in females.
Is it now? Huh. Didn't know that.
Is. And I have seen other people asking and theorizing and looking at, is there an association with highly sensitive people and neurodivergence in INFJ?
Yeah.
And I
I wouldn't
mean,
be surprised.
neither would I. And I mean, this is the thing as well, right? So INFJ, some of the features of INFJ are really deep, complex, rich inner world, right? And really this need for connecting with a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning and like really making sure that you are, you're being authentic and you're aligned with your values, right? Like integrity and authenticity are important, right? And justice and all these things are important to an INFJ. And they're also things that are representative of, some of the unique wiring that happens, right, in high sensitivity, right? And it also kind of connects with the aesthetic sensitivity, right? The three subcategories. So aesthetic sensitivity, part of it is this, like being moved by music and art and connection to nature and like having this like rich inner world and like deep thinking and connecting multiple different topics and like searching for meaning is all about aesthetic sensitivity, which is the third of the three subcategories. And what I'm kind of theorizing, I'm still looking at the research because some of this research that I'm looking at in terms of sensory processing sensitivity and aesthetic sensitivity is like 2024, 2025 studies, right? So this is quite new. And I'm theorizing that like the more you can kind of like accept that that's part of you and lean into that and leverage that part of yourself, right? Studies are showing that this actually increases your level of resilience and decreases your level and tendency for overwhelm, right? From as being a highly sensitive person. And so, like you've mentioned, the more you can accept who you are and how you're built and the unique way that you process information, right? As an INFJ, and also one of the common astrology patterns that I see are what are called Pluto aspects. So the planet Pluto is all about transformation and going into like the underworld and like deep dark depths of like tear it all apart so you could put it back together and like rebirth kind of thing. And if you have, some of your identity placements close to Pluto, like your sun or your moon, um, this can create something called it's a Pluto placement that I'm I'm seeing is something called the a Pluto identity, a Plutonian identity. And Plutonian identity, when somebody tends to have this, they tend to be very deep thinking and they're very complex, rich inner world. So a lot of things that are very similar to INFJ, right? So you can see a lot of overlaps. And I like to look at these things not to like create an identity for yourself and like not say this is my identity, more to kind of just understand the natural tendencies within you and then use that to sort of own your own uniqueness, right? Because some of these things and some of these things and some of these things can fit. Um, However, these things are not, it's not you. You know, you're the one observing all these things. And kind of going back to that, like, you know, I can see this a lot that people, there's this tendency to identify with these things, and it can kind of almost hold you back at times.
I think that's a really important thing, and I'm super glad that you mentioned it because I was thinking about this deeply the other day. I have a really dear friend who is, I call her a human design wizard. She's just like her brain and the way she functions with it. It's to a depth and a level that I struggle to keep up, to be honest. Um, but I was observing this thing in the people who are really big in human design and how they have a tendency to box themselves in. So I was talking about that concept with her of like, especially people who use human design in their business. I'll find them kind of immediately saying, well, I can't do that because I'm a projector, or I can't do that because I'm a generator, or I can't do that because of XYZ in my chart. And they've like really narrowly defined themselves. They have kind of staked their identity on their type, and not allowed themselves any flexibility around that. And so I think it's a really important, part of the conversation to say this is to understand yourself and accept yourself. It's not to rigidly box yourself in and to
Yeah,
define yourself solely by this.
exactly. Yes. And I mean, you know, even outside of these typing tools, I've seen it over and over again. I've seen it when I was in the autoimmune space and people identifying themselves with, I have autoimmunity. I am an autoimmune warrior. And it really can hold them back from actually stepping into the level of flourishing they can actually achieve. Right. And I've also seen it in the HSP and neurodivergent autism world as well. Right. And it's like, well, I have this,
1,000%.
so I can't do this. And, you know, maybe there is some truth to there are certain things that maybe are difficult or you might be incapable of doing. However, if you decide ahead of time that that's what's going to be, then you've created your own reality for yourself.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that is such an important thing that I don't think enough people talk about.
Agreed. Yeah. I often say that because, of course, my work is around high sensitivity and neurodivergence. And I probably should state this more, but I know I state this a lot. The very fact of like, hey, I don't use a label ever for the sake of boxing myself into a label. It's for the sake of understanding myself. Just because, and making sense and accepting myself and all of these things that you and I are already talking about. I'm not using these labels to then define myself and what's possible for me, and I will never be able to or I will always, alternatively.
Mhm.
um it's just simply for the sake of understanding. And I think and for community too, I think is a really important part of this, especially because I think people who are highly sensitive and neurodivergent can feel very othered. And so really being able to lean into and understand I'm not alone. There are other people out here who share similar experiences, I think is a really important part of the identity conversation. But again, staking your entire identity around anything, whether that be any kind of a label, can be quite dangerous.
Absolutely. Yes. Very good points. I love that. I think we see eye to eye on a lot of things.
Yeah, imagine that.
Imagine that. Um, yeah. Going back to your original question, like, what do I do? How do I do this? You know, that first step is helping them to empower themselves with more self-knowledge. And I mean, the people that I work with are already generally self-aware, right? They've already done like the therapy, and oftentimes, right, especially for highly sensitive people, there's this connection to you already have a lot of self-awareness. And oftentimes, like the therapists have, you know, probably graduated them, right? There's nothing more I can do. You already know so much. Um, However, not a lot of, the mainstream will focus on these particular aspects that are unique to their particular presentation. Now, the next step after that is then we start to go into kind of upgrading that unconscious mind, right? Clearing out the rest of that like survival OS that's probably still hanging out in the background, right? So even though you have this awareness of yourself now, there still might be this like the lens that you're looking through that's thinking, well, I need to make myself safe, right? And there's a lot of what I call survival reflexes that come with that. So behaviors that we tend to do that helped keep us safe, especially back then, right? Like people pleasing and like perfectionism and like rescuing others and like, all those different types of things that, it helped us back then to keep us safe. And I always say, what helps you to survive cannot help you to thrive. And so these are the things that we address, and they've already done so to a degree. However, usually they still find that maybe in certain situations or around certain people, they're still reflexing back to those old like people-pleasing ways, right? Or over-explaining themselves or masking or dimming themselves around other people, playing small so that maybe other people won't react negatively to them. And so I use a few different ways to do that. I use hypnotherapy, conscious connected breath work, and my favorite of all of them is timeline therapy. And it's based on neurolinguistic programming. And it was the thing for me that changed so much in one day that was equivalent to all the improvements that I had found in the 5 years prior. It was that impactful, and it really helps it guides your unconscious mind to essentially kind of like reframe all the things that were holding you back and keeping you stuck in that survival mode and create new meanings, right? The experience plus meaning equals belief. And so when your unconscious mind is able to establish new meanings to everything, then it changes the lens through which you're looking through. And in a sense, it completely changes your entire reality. Kind of like, Wayne Dyer said, when you change the way you look at things, the things that you look at change. And Marcel Proust, the French philosopher, said the real voyage of discovery consists not of just in seeing new landscape, but having new eyes, right? And so when you see differently, you've got this different lens, it changes everything. And that's kind of the next step that I take them through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I'm sitting over here really thinking about how similar and yet distinct our processes are that we take our clients through. Meaning I think we're getting at the same stuff and just using different modalities, right? And that is making me think of you may be familiar with her, Melissa Tiers. She's like, top level hypnotist. I love her work. And of course, like hypnotherapy is her modality, but she talks a lot about how it doesn't really matter the modality you use as long as it's getting at and rearranging things in the brain, right? As long as any effective modality has the element of you are accessing that memory and then you are implanting a different feeling with it.
Mhm.
And that really is all that we're doing in any of these modalities, and that is what is allowing that neuroplasticity to shift and to change. It's what's changing that association, right?
Exactly.
Instead of going down the same track that you've been down a million times before, that's a well-worn groove in your brain, you're gonna veer off and you're gonna do something different this time because you're feeling something different associated with that memory, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, I just think it's so cool that whenever I interview people like this, I'm over here nodding and I'm like, yes, yes, yes. I don't go about it in the same way, but I see the same components, and it's wildly effective. And I've always been someone that is, and again, this is probably all of my wiring, the neurocomplex wiring, but like mindset work never made sense to me. It never has. And, I'm not saying it doesn't have its place. I'm not on here trying to knock what other people are amazing at. I just think it's like skimming the surface of the ocean, Like we've got to go deeper than that in order for people to experience real change.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is the thing, all roads lead to Rome, right? So, you and I have similar but different approaches to get to the same place, and that makes total sense. And this is the thing, right? There's individuals that are going to resonate and respond more to your approach than my approach and my approach to your approach. And I think that's why it is so important to have so many practitioners that are kind of coming at it from different angles, right? Taking all the different roads. Um, yeah. And
Yeah, because different, exactly as you're saying, different things resonate. Like what you're describing, I think you said timeline therapy that's based on NLP. I do have a little bit of experience, like tiny bit of experience, receiving NLP, not a lot. Um, but it didn't land for me. And what did land for me is obviously the modalities that I use primarily, which is somatics. Like that was kind of a similar experience to what you're describing with the timeline therapy of like, whoa, like I did different things for a really long time. And then when I discovered somatic work, it really unlocked everything in me,
yeah.
which is of course why I lean into that. And it's, one tool in my tool belt. I have many.
Mm.
But exactly as you're saying, like it's really important because, and this brings me to another point. My brain is just kind of going off now, but I think as practitioners sometimes we can get so attached to a modality that if a client doesn't respond well to a modality, then we kind of force it on them, right?
Mhm.
And we're like, well, this modality, like for example, the fact that somatics works for me, I can then be like, well, if somatics doesn't work for you, something is wrong with you and you're not doing your client work and da 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 da. No, it just means somatics doesn't work for them in the same way it works for me. And that's why you need to have multiple different tools in your tool belt. And so that's a really important conversation as practitioners as well, to take a little rabbit trail.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, right? We're all multifactorial complex beings with different, you know, unique ways of responding. And like you said, it's so important to have multiple modalities. That this is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Um, and also to speak on when you were mentioning about mindset, mindset work and therapy and, these types of things, they can be helpful. However, they typically only address the conscious mind level. And the conscious mind level is actually run by the unconscious mind. And so if you're addressing the unconscious mind, but you have the conscious mind and you haven't touched the unconscious mind, sure, you might feel some improvement or a bit of a shift, but likely it won't last. It won't be as impactful as you want. And you're probably going to end up reflexing back to the state of operation of the unconscious mind at some point. Um, right? Which is why this deeper work that we're talking about here is so important. And and then what I tend to find is, once we do this like inner operating system upgrade of the unconscious mind, and they're looking through these new eyes and seeing reality in a completely different way, it's kind of unfamiliar to them, right? Because it's not something that was modeled to them growing up around them, especially with, neurotypicals who don't see things the same ways they do. And so the next step is actually guiding them through being able to sort of hold this, because what happens is in those first moments, in that first stage, once you do this like unconscious rewiring, you're creating these new neural networks. However, they're still baby. They're still baby networks, right? And those old networks are still like quote unquote hot. And so they can be so easy to fall back into, especially if you aren't continuing to work on strengthening the new neural networks. So that's kind of like continued work to anchor that in. And then to actually start to see what actually is possible. And this is the flourishing part, right? So now you develop this more positive inner environment with that, default mode network that has more positive internal loops. You're seeing things differently. You are understanding who you are and you're leveraging that, accepting it and owning it. And now it's about, okay, well, now that I do these things, I can see that there's so much more to life and reality than I thought was even possible. Right. And that's that flourishing bit. And realizing that, and I'm sure you can agree with this, everything starts from within yourself. And the more you become kind of whole and aligned and centered, like here in flow state, which, by the way, we enter flow state differently than the average individual, which I can touch upon if you like.
Yeah.
When we're in that state, then life, like people and the world responds differently to us. It's almost like, what happened here? These people have changed, but they didn't do anything different. No, I'm doing something different. And now the people around me are different, which is a huge realization. I don't know if you've noticed that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I 1,000% agree. That's why I talk a lot about how, business coaching, strategy, and all of that. It's like that is only going to get you so far as that internal operating system, as you're calling, is tuned in and working well and functioning. And that's why I do the internal work side, because I think it's so easy for us to come into a place of self-blame if a strategy isn't working, right? Of like, well, what happened? I copy and pasted this. Why isn't it working for me? Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing. Like we've already talked about, each one of us are unique. We're going to respond differently. We have different needs. We're built differently. And if you're trying to force something, and I see this a lot, right? Especially when you're trying to force something that you think you should be doing, right? Especially when you've been conditioned that like it should be this way, or you have certain expectations of exactly how it unfolds. It can start to cause a lot of tension within yourself, and that can actually kick you out of that flow state. And flow state is I don't know, do you know the 4 levels of consciousness? To me, through me, or sorry, to me, by me, through me, and as me.
mm,
Have you heard of that? I don't know if
I
you've
haven't. No.
okay. Um, yeah, so to me is that victim consciousness, like you have no
Mm,
power. By me is when you realize you can take action and, that changes your reality. Um, and I would say that society in general as a whole is in that by me consciousness right now, like that hustle culture, more, 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 push, 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 do, 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 right? Don't relax. You can relax when you're dead, right? And actually, it's estimated that 97% of the general population operate 90% of the time in levels 1 and 2. So, that kind of just shows you where we are in general with society. And level 3 through me is that flow state. It's like when you learn that what's actually going to help you more than trying to push, force, hustle, and control is, imagine if you're like in a canoe going down the river, and instead of trying to paddle up against the stream, against the current, is you actually allow yourself to go with the flow, right? And you let go of that control. And that's the thing that is so hard, especially for HSPs, because that's one of the things that has caused that trying to hold on to control is like a survival mechanism, a safety mechanism to try to keep us safe, to try to predict, to try to be in control of things that we feel like maybe we don't feel in control of. And it can almost come to a point where we identify with being the one, right, that figures things out and solves the problems and like is in control of everything. And oftentimes we were the one that were praised for that, right? And so it becomes part of our identity. However, so it's shown that flow state, in order to access flow state, there's a part of your prefrontal cortex that needs to quiet down in order to access flow state. And flow state is like in Taoist culture, they call it wu wei or effortless action, right? When you're so in the flow of something that it feels effortless, right? Time passes. Yeah. And so when our prefrontal cortex, that part that's trying to plan and prepare and overthink and control, that actually kicks you out of flow state. It's like one or the other. You can't have both. And, I'm finding information that's pointing to, those of us who are divergent thinkers, we we need we enter flow state differently than the average individual. Oftentimes, flow state is accessed through things like external challenges. And for those of us who are highly sensitive, um, our dopamine processing is different. And so it's not necessarily like achieving external challenges is a thing that's going to put us in flow state. It's more like curiosity and like deep thinking. However, doing it in a way where we're not trying to control and overthink using that part of the prefrontal cortex. And in order to do that, we need to find a sense of internal safety, right? If we don't feel safe, that prefrontal cortex is going to be overthinking, right? And we're going to be up here versus like in our body, which I'm sure you can relate to.
Yes.
And so that's part of it too, is actually guiding them like how to do that. Because it's one thing to understand the theory, and it's another to actually but how do I do that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, this is actually taking me back to my conversation that I had on my podcast actually just last week with Sarah Francis, who is actually a flow state coach.
Mm.
And she talks a lot about using, gosh, there was a specific name for it, and I'm going to butcher it because my brain is not thinking of it right now, but she does staff spinning. And it's her way of shutting off that prefrontal cortex. But she talks about just having that right challenge of like getting your body moving and kind of getting into your body and kind of shutting down your mind because it's just like such a repetitive action. Um,
Makes sense.
that's she calls it, I think, a transitionary tool. Like she uses it to transition in and out of work and in and out of flow state. So it's interesting. Yeah, I'm just tying those conversations together.
Yeah, I love that. I love connecting dots. Um, yeah. And in terms of that, I mean, those are the main things that I do. The one last thing that I'll just point to in terms of like tying this all together to like the differential susceptibility and the Vantage sensitivity piece is, once you can establish that inner emotional terrain and inner unconscious and inner operating system that's positively supportive, then, I mean, first of all, your capacity and resilience to tolerate external things that aren't necessarily positively supportive grows so that you're no longer feeling as overwhelmed and like feeling like that victim to the external world and all the noise and all the things, because you find that grounding within yourself. And, the other piece to this is understanding that with your wiring comes certain gifts. So things like connection to your intuition and pattern recognition and like nonlinear thinking and like innovative problem solving, like all those things are things that, people with sensory processing sensitivity have a tendency to have a greater connection to, maybe than the neuronormative world. And that connection grows the more you kind of, become whole and the more you end up having this positively supportive environment, and you fully accept yourself. These things they grow, they become more powerful. And that's where This makes me think of a conversation, actually, I think that you and I had on Threads a while back, right? Is there's some people who have connected to this and they're like, being highly sensitive is a superpower, right? Because you have these abilities. And then, of course, there's that other camp that's like, well, no, it's a disability. This sucks, right? And they're just kind of like fighting each other, right? And that kind of makes me think of like, that's kind of like an us versus them. If you're not with me, you're against me kind of thing. And that kind of makes me think of that level 4 consciousness, which is as me, which is understanding non-duality. There is no us versus them. Everything is. There is no judgment. There is no right or wrong, right? It all is. And that's that like transcendental third way, right? And understanding that and owning that and operating from this place. And, even that in general, understanding that, yeah, there are superpowers and there are also challenges, and it's important to address all of it, right? And when you're able to do that within yourself, that actually helps you, especially when you are a leader, to lead the way to show others that actually this is likely the more beneficial way to move forward with things, understanding, right? It's not us versus them. It's everything. And leading by example through that. I don't know. I was going to go somewhere with that, but I'll leave it.
No, I know I think we probably connected about this on Threads because I'm so huge on the third way, in general, in all areas of life and the non-dualistic views. And like, yes, it's both. It's both and can we include it all? Um, and it depends on the day and the moment and the hour, whether I feel like it's a disability or it's a superpower, and it's both. And I think just by the very definition of, and that's not just specific to us as highly sensitive neurodivergent people, that's any characteristic, any trait any of us have. If it's a strength, it's also a weakness in another facet, right? Um, that's just life. That's just how the cookie crumbles. That's not something unique to us.
Yeah.
And being able to see that and own that, and that fourth level of consciousness, as you're talking about, I think is super important. But I am sure that you and I and our INFJ 6-2 selves could go on forever and ever and really reminisce about all of this. I've so enjoyed it, but I will wrap us up now and just ask, how can people connect with you and learn more about you and your work, Michelle?
Yeah. So there's a few different ways. I'm active currently on Facebook and Instagram. More active on Facebook than Instagram. I'm also on Threads. However, right now I'm not. I'm going to get back to it. However, right now it's just kind of sitting there. And I also have a podcast called the Inner Purpose Podcast. So that's another way where I kind of go deeper into some of these thoughts that I shared with you today, if that's of interest, to learn more about that. So those are the main places that, any of your listeners can go and learn more about me. And right now I have a free offering. It's a guidebook with 4 of the major astrology patterns that I've found over and over again in my clients' charts, what they mean, and what that means for you in terms of your purpose, your strengths, your gifts, and what to consider, right, to really leverage that Vantage sensitivity. And so that guidebook will show you how to find out if you have those patterns, and if you do, what they mean. So that's also something that they can access through any of those portals that I've shared here.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And is there anything else you'd like to say in closing that feels like it needs another moment to wrap up from our podcast today? I know we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. So, I'm still putting puzzle pieces together. However, what I'm seeing is, if you're highly sensitive, neurocomplex, right? It's really important to understand yourself, accept who you are, not to try to work against yourself, right? Because that really causes a lot of struggle. And not just from the outside in terms of supporting yourself and your environment, but doing that inner work to accept yourself from the inside out and understand that the gifts that come with your wiring are the things that, they're so natural to you to leverage in your work. And that's going to help you to not only be more functional, but really flourish in what you're doing. And accept that, things like you're a deep thinker and all like these things that maybe, people tell you you're too intense. No, actually own it, because these are the things that are going to leverage you, your work, your purpose. And really, these are the things that we need more than ever right now. Like there's lots of changes happening. And all of these gifts, I think, are things that will create a ripple effect. And the more you're in that place, where you're aligned and you're using them, that's how you can create that like deeper meaning and contribution to the world that, I mean, if your listeners are like us, they probably feel like I want to contribute something. So I hope that
Good.
made sense.
It did. Well, I will move into just a few rapid fire questions now. What do you wish people knew about your experience as a highly sensitive person in the world?
Hmm. That yeah, they make you different, and that's not a bad thing. And once you understand it and own it, it can open up doors to a whole new reality that's beautiful.
Mm. What's the last thing that truly inspires you?
Mhm. I mean, the first thing that comes up is my clients inspire me every single day. Right? So, even my last client call yesterday, right? Just watching them grow and flourish, it inspires me to continue on with my own journey.
I love that. And what consistently brings you deep joy?
Hmm. The simplicity of connecting with my husband and my dog in nature. We have a cottage deep in the woods and we have a homestead property. And
Mm.
so when we spend time in these places together, just enjoying what is, those are my favorite times.
Oh, I love that so
Mm.
much. As someone who reconnecting with nature is kind of like my ultimate grounding and recentering as well. So, well, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. I know that you have put in just heaps of work in synthesizing this research and putting this all together and making all these connections. And I just feel like it's such a deep service to do that for people like myself and anybody else who identifies as highly sensitive or neurodivergent in order to help us understand ourselves better and to really move from this survival energy to truly thriving. It's just such a service. So thank you for using your gifts and the way that your brain naturally functions to serve and help the rest of us. I really appreciate it.
Ugh, it's my pleasure. And I mean, this is my Wu Wei flow, effortless action that feels good. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.